Majority Leader.
The Constitution of the United States was made not merely for the generation that then existed, but for posterity. Those are the words of Henry Clay, Mr. President, Kentucky's own. They underscore that the decision United States senators will make today will echo in the history of our nation. The very survival of our constitutional form of government requires an expert and independent judiciary. Without fair and impartial courts of justice, as Alexander Hamilton put it in the Federalist Papers, all the reservations of particular rights or privileges would amount to nothing. The courts guard our rights, and the Senate guards our courts. That, Mr. President, is why today is such an important day. That is why the vote we take this afternoon, a vote to confirm a new Associate Justice of the Supreme Court of the United States, represents one of the most consequential decisions a senator ever makes. The members of this body are duty-bound to ensure we confirm justices of the Supreme Court who are men and women of the highest character and the most superlative qualifications. So fortunately, that is just the sort of nominee who stands before us today. 12 weeks ago, the President nominated a jurist who's been described by legal peers of all political stripes as a superstar, a serious scholar, and who is legendary for his preparation and possesses the qualifications, the temperament, and the judicial philosophy to be an excellent Associate Justice. The President nominated a brilliant student of the law. Those who taught and knew the nominee at Yale say, quote, "It is hard to name anyone with judicial credentials as strong as Judge Kavanaugh." They describe a true intellectual, a leading thinker, and a wonderful mentor and teacher. And those he's mentored, a diverse group of bright young lawyers who've clerked for Judge Kavanaugh, talk about his work ethic, his unflinching, honest advice, and his fundamental humility. For 12 weeks, the Senate has seen that this is not empty praise. We've seen the legendary preparation of a tireless judge. We've seen the patience of a committed mentor and teacher. We've seen the humility of a true intellectual who let his record speak for itself. Each of us have seen this for ourselves. Every senator who came into this process with an open mind has seen that very same Brett Kavanaugh firsthand. We've seen his brilliance, his painstaking thoroughness on display in the 300-plus opinions he issued on the D.C. Circuit. For 12 years, Judge Kavanaugh excelled on the bench that many experts see as the second most important court in our nation. We've seen his geniality and kindness firsthand in our private meetings with the nominee, precisely the collegial approach that is so necessary on the court. We've seen his professional excellence as we reviewed more pages of documents pertaining to Judge Kavanaugh's career than for any other Supreme Court nomination in our history. Pages that depict a meticulous and dedicated public servant. And yes, we have now studied the results of seven FBI background investigations, inquiries that have produced no evidence whatsoever to corroborate any prior misconduct, but rather are consistent with all we know about this nominee's sterling character. This historically tall mountain of evidence adds up to one clear message. Judge Brett Kavanaugh is among the very best our nation has to offer. He will make the Senate and the country proud. He will serve with distinction on our highest court. He unquestionably deserves confirmation, and the country deserves such a Supreme Court justice. Now, Mr. President, as I've explained, the stakes are always high, where a Supreme Court confirmation is concerned. But this time, the stakes are higher, a lot higher than they've been in the past. I can't sum this up better than our friend and distinguished colleague, the senior senator from Maine, put it in her historic remarks yesterday. This is what the senior senator from Maine said: "It is when passions are most inflamed that fairness is most in jeopardy." She said, when passions are most inflamed is when fairness is most in jeopardy. We all know the events of recent weeks have strained the country's comity and fanned the flames of partisan discord. But even more critically, our very commitment to the basic principles of fairness and justice is also being tested. Basic principles of fairness and justice being tested right here. A vote to confirm Judge Kavanaugh today is also a vote to send a clear message about what the Senate is. This is an institution where the evidence and the facts matter. This is an institution where the evidence and the facts matter. This is the chamber in which the politics of intimidation and personal destruction do not win the day. That this is the body whose members themselves uphold the same commitment to American justice that we seek in the judges we examine. A vote to confirm Judge Kavanaugh today is a vote to end this brief, dark chapter in the Senate's history and turn the page toward a brighter tomorrow. The chamber we are privileged to occupy is often called the world's greatest deliberative body for good reason. We're called the world's greatest deliberative body for a good reason. When the rubber meets the road, when the hour is critical, when a historic precedent needs to be set, the United States Senate most often finds its way to doing what is right. Today, we can honor that history. We can vote to turn away from the darkness. We can vote to set a precedent about fairness and judgment that will define this body for the better. We can vote to confirm an excellent Supreme Court justice who will make the Senate and the American people proud. I yield the floor.
As a reminder to our guests in the galleries, expressions of approval or disapproval are not permitted in the Senate galleries. Under the previous question, all post-cloture time has expired. The question is on the nomination. Is there a sufficient second? Sergeant at Arms will restore order in the gallery.
Is there a sufficient second?
Is there a sufficient second? There is a sufficient second. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
The Sergeant at Arms will restore order in the gallery. The Sergeant at Arms will restore order in the gallery. The Sergeant at Arms will restore order in the gallery. The Sergeant at Arms has restored order in the galleries. The Sergeant at Arms will restore order in the gallery. The clerk may continue.
Ms. Baldwin. Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Bennett. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Booker. Mr. Bozeman. Mr. Brown. Mr. Burr. Ms. Cantwell. Mrs. Capito. Mr. Cardin. Mr. Carper. Mr. Casey. Mr. Cassidy. Ms. Collins.
The Sergeant at Arms will restore order in the gallery. Continue.
Mr. Coons. Mr. Corker. Mr. Cornyn.
Senator will suspend. Sergeant at Arms will restore order in the gallery. The Sergeant at Arms will restore order in the gallery. Zoom.
Mr. Cornyn. Ms. Cortez Masto. Mr. Cotton. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Daines. Mr. Donnelly. Ms. Duckworth. Mr. Durbin. Mr. Enzi. Mrs. Ernst. Mrs. Feinstein. Mrs. Fisher.
The Sergeant at Arms will restore order in the gallery. Continue.
Mr. Flake. Mr. Gardner. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mr. Graham. Mr. Grassley. Ms. Harris. Ms. Hassan. Mr. Hatch. Mr. Heinrich. Ms. Heitkamp. Mr. Heller. Ms. Hirono. Mr. Hoven. Mrs. Hyde-Smith. Mr. Inhofe. Mr. Isaacson. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Jones. Mr. Kane. Mr. Kennedy. Mr. King. Ms. Klobuchar. Mr. Kyle. Mr. Langford. Mr. Leahy. Mr. Lee. Mr. Manchin.
Clerk will suspend. The Sergeant at Arms will restore order in the gallery. The Sergeant at Arms will restore order in the gallery. The Sergeant at Arms will restore order in the gallery. Clerk may continue.
Mr. Markey. Mrs. McCaskill. Mr. McConnell. Mr. Menendez. Mr. Merkley. Mr. Moran. Ms. Murkowski. Mr. Murphy. Mrs. Murray. Mr. Nelson. Mr. Paul. Mr. Perdue. Mr. Peters. Mr. Portman. Mr. Reed. Mr. Risch. Mr. Roberts. Mr. Rounds. Mr. Rubio. Mr. Sanders. Mr. Sass. Mr. Schatz. Mr. Schumer. Mr. Scott. Mrs. Shaheen. Mr. Shelby. Ms. Smith. Ms. Stabenow. Mr. Sullivan. Mr. Tester. Mr. Thune. Mr. Tillis. Mr. Toomey. Mr. Udall. Mr. Van Hollen. Mr. Warner. Ms. Warren. Mr. Whitehouse. Mr. Wicker. Mr. Wyden. Mr. Young.
With my friend, the senator from Montana, Senator Daines, who is walking his daughter down the aisle this afternoon. If he were present and voting, he would have voted aye. I have voted no. The pair will not change the outcome of the vote. I therefore withdraw my vote.
The senator has that right.
Senators voting in the affirmative: Alexander, Barrasso, Blunt, Bozeman, Burr, Capito, Cassidy, Collins, Corker, Cornyn, Cotton, Crapo, Cruz, Enzi, Ernst, Fisher, Flake, Gardner, Graham, Grassley, Hatch, Heller, Hovind, Hyde-Smith, Inhofe, Isaacson, Johnson, Kennedy, Kyle, Langford, Lee, Manchin, McConnell, Moran, Paul, Perdue, Portman, Risch, Roberts, Rounds, Rubio, Sass, Scott, Shelby, Sullivan, Thune, Tillis, Toomey, Wicker, Young. Senators voting in the negative: Baldwin, Bennett, Blumenthal, Booker, Brown, Cantwell, Cardin, Casey, Coons, Cortez Masto, Donnelly, Duckworth, Durbin, Feinstein, Gillibrand, Harris, Hassan, Heinrich, Heitkamp, Hirono, Jones, Kane, King, Klobuchar, Leahy, Markey, McCaskill, Menendez, Merkley, Murray, Nelson, Peters, Reed, Sanders, Schatz, Schumer, Shaheen, Smith, Stabenow, Tester, Udall, Van Hollen, Warner, Warren, Whitehouse, Wyden. Mr. Murphy? Mr. Murphy, no. Mr. Carper. Mr. Carper, no.
As a reminder to our guests in the galleries, expressions of approval or disapproval are not permitted in the Senate gallery. Are there any senators in the chamber who wish to vote or change a vote? If not, on this vote, the ayes are 50, the nays are 48. The nomination of Brett M. Kavanaugh of Maryland to be an Associate Justice of the Supreme Court of the United States is confirmed.
Mr. President,
Majority Leader.
I ask consent the motion to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table, and the President be immediately notified of the Senate's action.
Without objection.
I suggest the absence of quorum.
Sergeant at Arms will restore order in the gallery. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.